Alright, y'all, so today wanted to do a very quick review of the 1960 film, The Alamo. This is a pretty famous historical film. It was directed by John Wayne, produced and starring him, and was kind of a personal passion project for always adapting this famous Texan historical event. And a little bit of context for this review. Number one, I am a born and raised Texan, so obviously, growing up in Texas, you probably have heard the phrase "Remember the Alamo," and we know a little bit about our history and such. And I always thought this period of time was really fascinating, and I always kind of was curious about the 1960 John Wayne Alamo film. Now, I've seen clips of this over the years, but I've never seen the movie in full. So I don't really have huge nostalgia for this movie per se. I actually remember seeing the 2004 version instead of the 1960 version. That being said, I know that a lot of people grew up on this movie, and this movie means a lot to a lot of people. Nonetheless, I wanted to give you my honest opinion of it. I'm going to start out with my initial opinion, go into my pros and cons, and my overall thoughts. For my initial opinions on the 1960 The Alamo film, I think it's a pretty solid movie. I think that it has a lot of great filmmaking techniques, but it is kind of hampered down, I think, by some of the pacing issues. And obviously, this film is pretty grossly inaccurate to the actual event. And there's a lot of inaccuracies to this movie, but depending on how you view that, that could be a flaw, or that could just be something that you ignore and just want to watch a good movie. Regardless, it's a solid movie. That being said, this movie is really fascinating in a lot of ways, and I'm not going to try to make this movie a history of the production kind of video or history of, as there's a lot of really fascinating things, and arguably the production of this movie is maybe even a little bit more fascinating than the movie itself. I mean, they had apparently built an entire town for this movie, like an historical version of San Antonio. I think it was near Brownsville in Texas. I could be mistaken, but it's also, I think, still there, and I think films still shoot there, which is pretty crazy. And this was like a personal passion project for Wayne. I think he actually invested his own money in it, and it was a little bit of a shame because this movie wasn't a box office smash when it came out. But regardless, to kind of start with my pros, because I don't want to get too deep into the production of this movie, for my pros, like I already stated, the 1960 Alamo is a really great film, filmmaking wise, right? Technicality speaking, John Wayne as a director does a really good job in this movie. I think it's a well directed movie. The editing is really solid. I think he can direct actors pretty well in this movie. I also thought the action sequences, the few that are in this movie, are really well done. And this was 1960, so there was no CGI included. These are all real armies, real extras, real explosions. It all is really great stuff. And even when we get to the final battle of the Alamo, so to speak, it is great. It is beautiful looking. I was just pretty much in awe when I was watching that last 20 to 30 minutes of the movie when it depicts the battle. It is really something spectacular. It's something like in terms of the scale, and I love a lot of old historical films that have these real armies and these real shots and real stuff happening on screen instead of CGI. Films like Waterloo from 1970. This is a similar film, and it's really, really well done. So the action sequences are really strong. And I already mentioned this, but I also thought that the directing was good, but also the writing and dialogue. While I would say that there are some issues with the writing here and there, the characterization and dialogue scenes in this movie are really great. Like, there's a lot of really cool quotes from this movie. Like, there's some iconic clips John Wayne, who plays Davy Crockett in this movie, spews out. And there's a lot of characters that also have similar scenes. They have just, in general, a lot of really great and quippy dialogue. Regardless if these people actually said those things, it is a really cool, thing. I also think the film, like I said, is beautifully shot. It has this timeless quality to it. It's a film that really, while, yeah, it shows its age, it's not like in a bad way, right? In my opinion, the scenes are well directed. There's some good dialogue. There's some good scenes. There's some good characterization. I also think, in general, the lead up to certain events and the context of certain events especially leading up to the Alamo and the final battle, are also pretty solid. I think if you don't know anything about Texas history, you might be a bit confused about this movie, but there are also things in this movie that I think an audience would completely understand, like, oh, the bad guys, the Mexicans, oh, these good guys, they got to do this and that. And it's a typical kind of old style Western kind of tone, but I think it overall works pretty well. Acting wise, everyone does a pretty great job here. I mean, John Wayne plays Davy Crockett. I think he does a great job here. The female Hispanic love interest character is pretty good in the movie. And in general, I think the casting is, really interesting and really solid. Also, I think Richard Widmark as Jim Bowie does a really good job. Even though I did hear that apparently on the production of this movie he didn't get along with Wayne. Doesn't really show in the final movie. It's really good. Lawrence Harvey, who plays William Barrett Travis, obviously does a really good job. And I think the bicker between those two, which did happen in our real life, was really well done. Like, honestly, some of the banter between these two characters are the most enjoyable parts of the movie, weirdly. Like, I don't know why. I just thought that the interaction between the two of them were really good. And, like, John Wayne's character is kind of the in-between. But it's pretty good stuff. And then, like I said, I think most of the cast is really good. I think that John Wayne or Davy Crockett's supporting cast of characters, they all have interesting personalities. And in general, there's some also really great dialogue. Once again, I already mentioned this, but really good stuff. And I think in general, the cast all does a great job. I also want to mention, too, even though, like I said, there's a lot of things about this movie, and I'll mention it with my cons part about it, that are very inaccurate compared to the real events. But I will say this. There are some great dialogue, and I think in general the Mexican army is portrayed very neutral in this movie. Now, I think there's certain aspects of how they're portrayed I think, like I said, I don't think the movie goes out of its way to disrespect them, right? It doesn't make them like villains, right? It treats them with an astonishing amount of respect, which I have to, like, highly, highly respect, right? It treats them with empathy. It treats them like they're human beings. It doesn't treat the Mexicans as some kind of third world idiots. It betrays the Mexican army as this big, imposing, and well-trained force. There's a really great line with one of the characters in the Alamo that mentions this, basically saying something along the lines of, "Ooh, these guys look like, they look like clowns. They're wearing all these, Napoleon-style uniforms. They're not really real fighting men." And then someone else responds to him saying, "Oh, these guys are definitely fighting men. They've been, for the past 2 years, putting down revolts." Small things like that, it, like I said, it leaves an impact, and it doesn't villainize the Mexican army. Even Santa Anna's but not betrayed like a villain. He's betrayed like a commander. And, little things like that, I think, go a long way in my positive view of this movie. It treats the Mexicans with respect. And while this movie is pretty inaccurate, it's kind of weird, right? Some things about this movie are kind of weirdly intelligent, how it's written. And, like, weirdly, like, the writer probably knew some things about history. So it's really cool stuff. Also, I already mentioned this, but the practicality of it all, the costumes, while not entirely accurate, look great. The costumes of the characters look great. I already mentioned this, but the sets look great. And I already mentioned how the Mexican army, and in general how Spanish people are portrayed in this movie. They're not like the racist stereotypes doing this and that. They're portrayed like people and like a way of culture. And like I said, I really appreciated that depiction of them. Something I think the 2004 movie, I haven't seen a movie in quite a while, suffers from in terms of portraying the Mexican soldiers, at least in particular Santa Anna. But yeah, there's some really cool stuff. Even though there's a lot of inaccuracies, there's other things I really like about this movie. I think one weird thing is that Jim Bowie has like this crazy 6-barrel gun. And I kind of confused. I was like, is that a real weapon? Like, there's no way that was a real weapon. But it was. And, theoretically, it was made before the events of the Alamo happened in 1836. It was something that was created in the 17th century. It was not really a practical weapon. It was called a knock. I believe that's what it was called. And it was used mainly in, water maritime activities. But, it's a really weird detail, and obviously Jim Bowie didn't have anything like this. But, I mean, it's a cool little feature, and I like it, and I don't know, just a cool weapon, makes it makes kind of the movie stand out a little bit more. But that's kind of some of my cons. I think the romantic nature of it's also really good. The film aspect of it all, I think in general, just a kind of old classic, fun kind of historian kind of western kind of movie. And it's got a really nice tone and quality to it. Like, you can easily sit down for a few hours on a Friday night and enjoy this with your loved one and probably have a fun time with it. Now I'm going to get into some of my cons, because I don't think this movie is perfect, and I think you just got to mention some of the inaccuracies that come with this movie. Number one, I already mentioned this earlier, but some of the pacing. Now, I watched the almost 3-hour cut of this movie, which is the theatrical version. I have not seen the extended roadshow version of it, which is over 3 hours. I don't know if that's any better. I've heard people say it is better, but I can't really, vouch for that. That being said, the pacing. This movie, while I think it's kind of strange, I think the first half of this movie is very sluggish in its pacing. There's a lot of meandering scenes and tangents that Wayne likes to go on, like, the female Hispanic character. And while it's nice and it's not your typical love romance story, it doesn't really add anything to the plot. And like I said before, this movie kind of, in my opinion, meanders around in the first hour. I think the pacing is kind of sluggish. I think that there could have been some scenes that could have been chopped out, and maybe there could have been scenes put in that maybe helped establish context for the backdrop of the events of the Alamo. Because the movie just kind of messes around, it's sluggish, especially when, Crockett and his band of followers arrive in San Antonio, and there's a bunch of elaborate scenes with them being drunk and dancing, and, it's all fun and nice, and there's some great dialogue like usual, but it's, like I said, it feels sluggish, it's kind of slows the movie down, and like I said, not hugely necessary to the story as a whole. So I think that they could have probably even more so chopped down this movie, maybe replaced it with more essential scenes. In general, I just think the pacing, especially in the first half. Now, this is not really a problem in the second half, to my opinion. Maybe that's just because by the second half of the movie, they're actually doing stuff, which, probably improve the pacing. But yeah, the first half of the movie is kind of sluggish. Now, there's also some pretty ridiculous moments in this movie, and I'm going to get into this more of my inaccuracies with the history of with the Alamo and versus the John Wayne Alamo. There's some pretty insane sequences. For example, Davy Crockett and his followers go inside the Mexican army that's stationed outside the Alamo and steal a whole livestock of animals right under the Mexican army's noses. And I think it's a really goofy scene. Like, it's fun. It's immediately one of my fun moments of the movie for sure, but it's entirely stupid. And that's one thing I mentioned earlier. While the Mexican army, for the most part, is portrayed with respect, I have to view these scenes where these people are going behind the lines of the enemy and doing all these crazy things. And I'm like, how incompetent is the Mexican army? Like, you let a whole livestock of animals back into the Alamo? It's just ridiculous stuff. It's ridiculous stuff. It's really absurd. And obviously, none of that happened, right? There was no historical record of Crockett going behind the lines, getting a bunch of livestock of animals. Yeah, and there's even more scenes where they kind of try to steal food and destroy a cannon. And once again, like I said before, there's just no historical record of that, right? There's just no, most of the time the defenders were inside the Alamo, especially when the army started to arrive. And I can go on and on about, huge inaccuracies. One of the big ones is the final battle itself. The Alamo was a battle that happened very in the early morning hours and happened in darkness. It did not happen in the daylight, which was probably, like I said, a filmmaking decision to make it easier for the audiences to see what happened. Now, like I said, a movie doesn't have to be, insanely accurate to history to be good. That's the nature of the art form and adaptation. You have to make certain changes to make the material work. But I do think if you're adapting an historical event, I do think you do have a responsibility to at least portray those events, even if you do make changes, with similar kind of events that led up to it and with a similar kind of understanding and motivation, so that people that can walk away from the movie think, oh, this is exactly what this event was, and the historian can say, yep, that's right, you got the whole moment. And I think people that walk away from the Alamo, if you view this as an historical movie, I think you're going to be kind of mistaken. I think you got to view this movie as a fictional part of history. It's a film, right? It's a film fiction history thing, not an historically accurate movie. That being said, there's obviously a lot of blatant things that are just not true about this movie. And there's a lot of Cold War era politics put into this movie. Like, for example, the movie kind of dances around the issue of slavery, which I really didn't particularly like. Jim Bowie has a slave, and like at the end of the movie, he frees him, and then the slave decides to stay with the defenders and fight. I'm not saying that like that's entirely like something like that never happened, but it kind of, I don't know, it kind of presents the whole really tired stereotype of the loyal slave kind of thing. And it's just like I said, especially when you get into Civil War films and Civil War history becomes more apparent. It's not a huge issue, and it's fine. It's a good scene. But just, like I said, it kind of reeks of that, good, loyal slave kind of thing. And obviously, some of the people in the Alamo were actually not great people. One of the most famous ones is William Travis. The movie really dances around the fact he's like this really polite, really uptight army commander, or, colonel, so to speak. But in real life, he wasn't really that great of a guy. He apparently left his pregnant wife, and he was an avid slave supporter and slave trader. And I'm sorry, I don't rock with that. And this is also kind of a larger problem. Now, this is not really an issue with the movie, I guess, because I think in general, it's a little bit harder to adapt a movie like The Alamo, because the Texan Revolution, while on the surface may seem simple, is not a simple thing to explain. And I don't think the movie does a great job at establishing the context. There are certain scenes of Sam Houston, and they try to, kind of display the urgency of the situation. I do think they get the message across that, the Alamo was there to buy time for Sam Houston to build up his army, which is true. That being said, there's a lot of, like I said, a lot of missing context here. A lot of things. If you don't know anything about the Texas Revolution, I wouldn't be surprised. And I can kind of figure out like why this movie didn't do incredibly well when it came out, because people were probably kind of confused. They're like, wait, huh? Mexico, Texas, Santa Ana, he's invading Texas? What? Like I said, it didn't really establish the context well. And I think, if maybe Wayne took out some of the scenes where they're kind of meandering and doing non-really important things, and maybe establish scenes that would have helped, gave greater context, this movie, in my opinion, might have been a little better. Obviously, the Texas Revolution is a really complicated thing. The Texans, the American settlers, the Anglo settlers that were in the region that was known as Texas at the time, or Tejas, obviously rebelled for multiple reasons, and it wasn't like an exactly complete process. Like, it wasn't like, we were going to rebel and we're going to create our own country. It was a gradual process. I mean, by the time the Alamo was happening, it wasn't really clear, like, if they're going to actually, by the point the Alamo happened, if I remember correctly, the decision by the rebellion was, okay, now we're going to create an independent state. And during it, they're going to be forming a government, which I think, as the 2004 movie did a lot better and showed the context of certain events, in my opinion, and just a greater overall picture, a bit better than the Alamo film from John Wayne. And obviously, there's a lot of dark and murky stuff that I do think needs to be mentioned with the Texas Revolution. Like I said, the issue of slavery. I'm not going to try to turn this video into a huge historical lesson, but the, kind of issue of slavery, that settlers were bringing their slaves over. Mexico at that point had already banned slavery, so you can kind of view it certain ways. But that being said, I'm going to get off topic. The inaccuracies, I do think some of them do really bother me in this movie. Like, for example, the slavery thing, some of the context issues, the greater picture. Some of them don't bother me, like the fact that the Alamo, the battle happens in daylight. There are certain things about the army. There's certain moments that never happened. Like, for example, how Davy Crockett died, Jim Bowie died. Obviously not accurate, but like I said, I do get it. So like I said, it's a mixed bag with some of the inaccuracies. Some of them I don't mind. Some of them I do mind. It's a little bit of a mixed bag. But yeah, overall, to kind of give you my thoughts on the 1960 Alamo, If you look at this as a historical film, you will not like this movie. Straight up, you won't. It's insanely inaccurate. There's a lot of issues with it. It's very much made of its time in that kind of Cold War era. But if you do appreciate this movie as just a piece of fiction that's happening to adapt a real life event, but just kind of view it as a historical fan fiction, it's a decent movie. It's a decent movie. It's a fun time watching. There's a lot of really great dialogue, a lot of really great action sequences, some really goofy stuff, some really bad pacing issues, and obviously some bad inaccuracies. But if you, like I said, if you view it as a historical fan fiction, it's pretty solid. And honestly, I had a decent time watching this. It's okay. So John Wayne's 1960 Alamo, not my favorite version of the Alamo, even on film, but it's a decent movie overall, and I didn't hate it. But yeah, that's my thoughts on this movie. Hopefully you all have a good day, and peace, y'all.